Marcus Thompson stood at attention outside the courthouse, his military bearing still evident despite trading his Royal Guard uniform for a crisp black suit. 20 years of protecting dignitaries had taught him to observe everything, and today he noticed the subtle signs of corruption that others missed. The way certain lawyers whispered in corners, how some court clerks avoided eye contact, and most telling of all, how Judge Harrison's expensive watch gleamed under the fluorescent lights on a government salary. Marcus had never planned to become a lawyer. His path had been simple: serve the crown, protect the realm, retire with honor. But life had different plans when he witnessed something that changed everything. 3 years ago, while on duty at a state dinner, he overheard a conversation between Judge Harrison and a wealthy businessman named Vincent Corelli. They spoke in hushed tones about case outcomes, about money changing hands, about justice being bought and sold like commodities. The next day, Marcus watched from the gallery as Judge Harrison dismissed charges against Corelli's son, who had been caught dealing drugs near a school. The evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses credible, yet Harrison found technical loopholes that freed the young man. Marcus saw the devastation in the prosecutor's eyes, the tears of the community members who had hoped for justice, and he knew he had to act. But how does a Royal Guard fight corruption in the courts? Marcus spent months researching, learning about legal procedures and requirements. He discovered that many jurisdictions allowed non-traditional paths to legal careers, especially for those with military or law enforcement backgrounds. His commanding officer, Colonel Davies, initially thought Marcus had lost his mind when he requested educational leave. "You want to study law?" Colonel Davies had asked, raising an eyebrow. "Thompson, you're one of our best guards. You could make sergeant major within 2 years." Marcus had stood straight, his decision unwavering. "Sir, there are different ways to serve justice. I believe this is mine." The transition wasn't easy. While his fellow guards practiced drills, Marcus buried himself in legal textbooks, constitutional law, criminal procedure, evidence rules, concepts that were as foreign to him as military tactics would be to most lawyers. His classmates, mostly fresh-faced college graduates, looked at the stern military man with curiosity and sometimes suspicion. Professor Williams, who taught criminal law, became an unexpected ally. She recognized something in Marcus that others missed, not just intelligence, but a deep sense of justice that came from years of seeing the world's harsh realities. During office hours, she would challenge him with complex scenarios, watching as his analytical mind broke down legal problems the same way he once assessed security threats. "You think differently than my other students," she told him one evening, as he worked through a particularly difficult case study. "They see law as theory. You see it as a tool." Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Law wasn't academic to him. It was a weapon against the corruption he had witnessed, a shield to protect the innocent people he had sworn to serve in a different capacity. The hardest part wasn't the studying or the career change. It was keeping quiet about what he knew while he prepared himself to act. Every day he read about cases that should have been won, about criminals walking free, about families destroyed by a broken system. The temptation to speak out immediately was overwhelming, but Marcus had learned patience in the military. Good strategy required proper timing. His fellow guards began to notice the change. During breaks, instead of joining their usual conversations about sports or weekend plans, Marcus would be reading case law or practicing legal arguments in his head. Some thought he was becoming antisocial, but his closest friend, James Peterson, understood that Marcus was preparing for something important. "You're planning something big, aren't you?" James asked one day as they stood guard outside a diplomatic reception. Marcus kept his eyes forward, his expression neutral. "Just trying to better myself." But James knew better. In 20 years of friendship, he had learned to read Marcus like a book. This wasn't about self-improvement, this was about justice. And knowing Marcus, whatever he was planning would shake things up in ways no one expected. As Marcus approached his final year of law school, he began to formulate his plan. He wouldn't just become another lawyer fighting corruption from the sidelines. He would use his unique background, his military precision, and his insider knowledge to take down the network he had discovered. Judge Harrison was just the beginning. Marcus had spent 3 years documenting connections, following money trails, and building a case that would expose the entire system. The day finally came when Marcus Thompson, former Royal Guard, walked across the stage to receive his law degree. In the audience, Colonel Davies watched with pride and curiosity, wondering what his former subordinate would do with his new qualification. Professor Williams smiled, knowing she had helped shape not just a lawyer, but a force for justice. But it was Judge Harrison, attending his nephew's graduation ceremony, who felt the first chill of unease as he watched the stern military man accept his diploma. Something about Marcus Thompson made him nervous, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. The judge had no idea that his corruption had been under surveillance by one of the most determined men he would ever face. Marcus looked out at the audience, his expression calm but his mind racing with plans. The real work was about to begin, and Judge Harrison had no idea what was coming for him. Marcus spent his first 6 months as a licensed attorney, working at a small firm that handled minor criminal cases. To outside observers, he seemed like any other new lawyer learning the ropes, but his real education was happening in the shadows. Every case gave him deeper insight into how the corrupt network operated. Every court appearance taught him more about Judge Harrison's patterns and preferences. The breakthrough came when Sarah Mitchell walked into his office. She was a young mother whose teenage son Danny had been arrested for robbery, a crime she swore he didn't commit. What caught Marcus's attention wasn't just her desperation, but the details of the case. Danny had been arrested by Detective Ray Holbrook, the same officer who seemed to be involved in many of Judge Harrison's questionable cases. They say Danny robbed a convenience store, Sarah explained, tears streaming down her face. But he was with me at his grandfather's funeral that day. I have photos, witnesses. Even the funeral director remembers him. Detective Holbrook won't listen to any of it. Marcus reviewed the police report and immediately spotted inconsistencies. The witness descriptions didn't match Danny's appearance. The timeline was impossible given the boy's documented alibi. And most suspicious of all, the store's security camera had mysteriously malfunctioned just during the time of the robbery. This case had all the hallmarks of a frame-up. But why target a random teenager from a poor family? The answer came when Marcus dug deeper into Danny's background. The boy's father had died in a construction accident 2 years earlier, an accident that had resulted in a lawsuit against Corelli Construction Company, Vincent Corelli's business empire. The family had been close to winning a significant settlement when the father died under mysterious circumstances, leaving them financially devastated and legally defenseless. They're sending a message, Marcus realized as he studied the connections. Mess with Corelli's money and your family pays the price. But proving it would require more than legal research. Marcus activated skills he hadn't used since his Royal Guard days, conducting surveillance and gathering intelligence. He followed Detective Holbrook after work, documenting his visits to expensive restaurants and noting his new luxury car that shouldn't be affordable on a police salary. He photographed meetings between Holbrook and known associates of Corelli, building a visual timeline of corruption. The most damning evidence came from an unexpected source. Marcus had befriended Tony Ricci, a courthouse maintenance worker who cleaned offices after hours. Tony had worked there for 15 years and seen things that would shock most people, but he had always kept quiet out of fear. Marcus's military bearing and obvious integrity finally gave Tony someone he felt he could trust. I've seen Judge Harrison meet with that businessman Corelli after hours, Tony confided during a coffee break. They think nobody notices, but I see everything. Harrison gets envelopes, sometimes briefcases. Always happens before big cases involving Corelli's interests. Tony agreed to help Marcus document these meetings, using his access to install a hidden camera in Harrison's office. The footage they captured over the next month was devastating. Clear evidence of money changing hands, discussions of case outcomes, and most importantly, recorded conversations about framing innocent people like Danny Mitchell. While building his evidence case, Marcus also had to actually defend Danny in court. This would be his first major trial, and Judge Harrison would be presiding. The irony wasn't lost on him. He would be arguing for justice in front of the very judge he was investigating for corruption. The day of the hearing arrived, and Marcus entered the courtroom with military precision. He had prepared for this moment like a strategic military operation, anticipating every possible move from the opposition. District Attorney Karen Wells, who prosecuted the case, was surprised to see such a new lawyer taking on what seemed like a hopeless defense. Judge Harrison looked down at Marcus with barely concealed irritation. Something about the new attorney bothered him, though he couldn't identify exactly what. Harrison was used to intimidating lawyers, using his position to pressure them into plea bargains or weak defenses, but Marcus stood with the confident bearing of a man who had faced real danger and wasn't impressed by courtroom theatrics. "Your Honor," Marcus began his opening statement, "the prosecution's case against Danny Mitchell isn't just weak, it's impossible. They're asking you to believe that a 17-year-old boy could be in two places at once, that multiple witnesses are lying, and that security cameras conveniently malfunction whenever it suits their narrative." As Marcus presented Danny's alibi, he watched Harrison's reaction carefully. The judge's discomfort was obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. Harrison kept glancing at Detective Holbrook, who sat in the back of the courtroom with increasing nervousness. The turning point came when Marcus called Sarah Mitchell to testify about her son's whereabouts during the alleged robbery. As she described attending her father-in-law's funeral with Danny, Marcus noticed Harrison trying to rush her testimony. But Marcus had learned to control courtroom timing from his military experience, and he methodically walked Sarah through every detail of that day. "Mrs. Mitchell," Marcus asked, "did anyone else see Danny at the funeral?" "Dozens of people," she replied. "Our whole family was there, plus friends, neighbors, even some of my husband's former co-workers from Corelli Construction." The mention of Corelli Construction caused a visible reaction in Judge Harrison, who quickly tried to sustain an objection that hadn't even been made. Marcus filed away that reaction for future use while continuing his methodical destruction of the prosecution's case. When Detective Holbrook took the stand, Marcus was ready. Using techniques learned from interrogating suspects during his security work, he calmly dismantled Holbrook's testimony piece by piece. The detective became increasingly flustered as Marcus pointed out inconsistencies, impossible timelines, and convenient oversights in the investigation. "Detective Holbrook," Marcus said with military precision, "isn't it true that you never actually interviewed any of the witnesses who could confirm Danny Mitchell's alibi?" "We focused on the evidence that supported the charges," Holbrook stammered. "Or evidence that you needed to support predetermined charges," Marcus countered. Judge Harrison slammed his gavel. "Counselor, stick to questions." But Marcus had made his point. The seeds of doubt were planted, and even Harrison couldn't completely suppress the truth when it was presented with such methodical precision. The evidence against Detective Holbrook's credibility was mounting, but Marcus knew Judge Harrison would try to salvage the case to protect his corrupt network. What he didn't expect was how brazenly Harrison would abuse his judicial power. During the lunch recess, Marcus discovered that the judge had improperly met with District Attorney Wells in his chambers, a clear violation of judicial ethics. Marcus confronted this violation immediately when court resumed. "Your Honor, I understand you met privately with the prosecution during recess. This is highly irregular and prejudicial to my client's rights." Harrison's face reddened with anger. "Counselor, you're out of line. I'll warn you once about making accusations in my courtroom." But Marcus had learned something important from his military service. Never back down from bullies, especially when innocent people depend on you. "Your Honor, I'm not making accusations. I'm stating facts. Court reporter, please note that Judge Harrison has admitted to an ex parte communication with the prosecution." The courtroom fell silent. Other attorneys present had never seen anyone challenge Judge Harrison so directly. Harrison realized he had walked into a trap. Confirming the improper meeting by his defensive reaction, his anger shifted to something more dangerous. A determination to crush this upstart lawyer who dared question his authority. "Mr. Thompson," Harrison said through gritted teeth, "approach the bench." Marcus walked forward with military bearing. Unintimidated by the judge's attempt at intimidation, Harrison leaned forward, speaking in a low voice he thought others couldn't hear. But Marcus had positioned himself so the court reporter and jury could catch every word. "You're playing a dangerous game, counselor. Drop this attitude, or you'll find practicing law in this district very difficult." Marcus met Harrison's glare with steady eyes. "Your Honor, are you threatening me in open court?" Harrison realized he had been outmaneuvered again. Every word was being recorded, and the jury was watching his unprofessional behavior with growing concern. He had let his anger override his usual careful manipulation, exposing himself in ways that a more experienced corrupt judge never would. For this Afternoon session continued with Marcus systematically proving Danny's innocence while carefully documenting Harrison's biased rulings. Each time the judge made an unfair decision, Marcus would calmly object for the record, building a case for appeal while also gathering evidence of judicial misconduct. The breakthrough came when Marcus called his surprise witness, Tony Ricci, the maintenance worker. Harrison couldn't object without revealing why he didn't want Tony to testify, so he had to allow it. Tony nervously took the stand, but Marcus's encouraging presence gave him strength to tell the truth. "I clean the courthouse after hours," Tony began. "I see things, hear things. I seen Judge Harrison meeting with Vincent Corelli lots of times, always late at night when nobody else is around." District Attorney Wells objected frantically, but Marcus had laid proper foundation for the testimony. "Your Honor, this testimony goes to potential bias and corruption affecting this case. Mr. Corelli's construction company was being sued by Danny Mitchell's deceased father. Harrison was trapped. Sustaining the objection would look suspicious, but allowing the testimony would expose his corruption. He chose to allow it, hoping to minimize the damage, but Tony's testimony was devastating. "I seen money change hands," Tony continued. "Briefcases, envelopes. Judge Harrison would get these things before big trials involving Mr. Corelli's business interests. Then those cases would always go Corelli's way." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Harrison slammed his gavel repeatedly, but the damage was done. The jury, the court reporter, and everyone present had heard clear testimony about judicial corruption. Marcus noticed several people in the gallery secretly recording with their phones, ensuring this testimony would reach beyond the courtroom. During cross-examination, District Attorney Wells tried to discredit Tony, but the maintenance worker stuck to his story. He had nothing to gain and everything to lose by lying, which made his testimony even more credible. Wells, realizing her case was collapsing and potentially exposing the corruption she may have been complicit in, began distancing herself from the prosecution. Judge Harrison called for an early recess, clearly shaken by the revelations. Marcus used the break to ensure Tony's safety, arranging for his friend James Peterson to provide protection. Corrupt networks often eliminated witnesses, and Marcus wasn't going to let an innocent man be harmed for telling the truth. When court resumed, Harrison made a desperate attempt to control the damage. He tried to strike Tony's testimony from the record, claiming it was prejudicial and irrelevant. But Marcus was ready with legal precedents showing that testimony about judicial bias was not only relevant, but essential for a fair trial. "Your Honor," Marcus argued, "if this court is compromised by corruption, then no defendant can receive fair treatment. This testimony goes to the heart of due process." Harrison found himself in an impossible position. Every ruling he made now looked suspicious. Every decision seemed to confirm the allegations against him. The other attorneys in the courtroom watched in fascination as a new lawyer systematically dismantled not just a case, but an entire corrupt system. As the day ended, Marcus had achieved something remarkable. He had not only established Danny Mitchell's innocence beyond any reasonable doubt, but he had also exposed the corruption that had pervaded the courthouse for years. Judge Harrison looked like a man whose world was crumbling around him, because that's exactly what was happening. But Marcus knew this was just the beginning. Harrison and his co-conspirators wouldn't go down without a fight, and they had resources and connections that could make life dangerous for anyone who threatened them. The former Royal Guard prepared for battle, knowing that the next phase would test all his skills and courage. The verdict came swift and decisive, not guilty on all charges. Danny Mitchell broke down in tears as his mother hugged him, finally believing that justice still existed. But Marcus knew that winning this case was only the first battle in a much larger war. As the courtroom cleared, he noticed the dangerous looks from Detective Holbrook and the whispered conversations between Harrison and several men in expensive suits. Within hours of the verdict, Marcus received his first warning. Someone had vandalized his car in the courthouse parking lot, scratching "back off" into the paint. A lesser man might have been intimidated, but Marcus had faced real threats during his military service. Vandalism only confirmed he was on the right track. The next morning brought more serious escalation. Marcus arrived at his office to find it had been broken into during the night. Nothing was stolen, but his files had been searched, his computer accessed, and a dead rat left on his desk with a note. "Rats die in this town. The message was clear. Stop investigating or face consequences. Instead of backing down, Marcus doubled his security measures and accelerated his investigation. He moved his evidence to secure locations and began working with federal contacts from his military days. The corruption in the local courthouse was bad enough to warrant FBI attention, but Marcus needed more proof before bringing in federal authorities. His breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Detective Holbrook's partner, Detective Maria Santos, contacted Marcus secretly. Santos had been suspicious of Holbrook's activities for months, but had been afraid to speak out. Tony Ricci's courage in testifying had inspired her to come forward. Holbrook's been dirty for years, Santos confided during a clandestine meeting in a parking garage. He gets assignments from someone above him, targets specific people, plants evidence when necessary. The Mitchell kid wasn't the first innocent person he's framed. Santos provided Marcus with a list of suspicious cases, all involving people who had crossed Vincent Corelli's interests. Construction workers who had reported safety violations, business owners who had refused to pay protection money, journalists who had investigated Corelli's connections to organized crime. Each case had followed the same pattern: arrest by Holbrook, trial before Harrison, conviction despite weak evidence. There's more, Santos continued. Holbrook keeps records of everything as insurance. He's got files on all the payoffs, all the fixed cases, all the threats. If anything happens to him, those files go to the FBI. This information gave Marcus a new strategy. Instead of just exposing the corruption, he could potentially flip Holbrook by offering him protection in exchange for cooperation. But first, he needed to ensure his own safety and gather enough evidence to make the case stick. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Vincent Corelli, frustrated by the Mitchell case outcome and worried about exposure, decided to take direct action against Marcus. He sent 2 of his enforcers to deliver a more personal message, not knowing that Marcus had spent 20 years training for exactly this kind of confrontation. The attack happened outside Marcus's apartment on a rainy Thursday evening. 2 men approached him in the parking garage, one carrying a baseball bat, the other a knife. They clearly expected to intimidate a soft lawyer, not a former Royal Guard with extensive combat training. Mr. Thompson, the larger man said, hefting his bat, Mr. Corelli wants you to understand that your legal services are no longer needed in this town. Find another line of work. Marcus assessed the situation with military precision. 2 attackers, confined space, multiple weapons, civilian area where gunfire would endanger innocents. His response was swift and decisive. Using techniques learned from years of protecting dignitaries, he disarmed both men within seconds, leaving them unconscious on the garage floor. But instead of calling the police and who might be compromised, Marcus used the incident as an opportunity. He photographed the attackers, searched their belongings for identification, and discovered something valuable. One of them carried a cell phone with text messages directly from Corelli ordering the intimidation. The next day, Marcus made his move. He arranged to meet Detective Holbrook privately, using Santos as an intermediary. The meeting took place in a diner outside the city limits, neutral ground where both men could speak freely. Detective Holbrook, Marcus began, placing photos of the 2 attackers on the table. Your boss tried to have me beaten up last night. These men are now in federal custody, and they're talking about who sent them. Holbrook paled as he recognized Corelli's enforcers in the photos. I don't know what you're talking about. Ray, I can call you Ray, can't I? Your world is collapsing. Judge Harrison is under federal investigation. Vincent Corelli is desperate enough to order violence, and you're the one person who can connect all the pieces. You can either go down with them, or you can help us clean up this mess. Marcus pulled out a legal document. This is an immunity agreement I've prepared with federal prosecutors. Full protection in exchange for your cooperation and testimony. Your insurance files about the payoffs and fixed cases could put the real criminals away while keeping you safe. Holbrook stared at the document, his hands shaking slightly. He had been living in fear for years, knowing too much about dangerous people, while being too deep in their schemes to escape. Marcus's offer was the lifeline he never thought would come. If I cooperate, Holbrook asked quietly, what happens to my family? Corelli doesn't forgive, and he doesn't forget. Federal witness protection, Marcus replied. New identities, new location, fresh start. Your kids can grow up without looking over their shoulders. The decision wasn't easy for Holbrook, but the alternative was clear. Stay loyal to Corelli and risk being eliminated as a liability, or help Marcus expose the truth and gain protection. Over the next hour, Marcus's military bearing and obvious integrity convinced Holbrook that cooperation was his only viable option. "Okay," Holbrook finally said. "I'll help you. But you need to understand this goes deeper than just Harrison and Corelli. There are judges, prosecutors, politicians, even some federal people involved. We're talking about millions of dollars and decades of corruption." Marcus nodded grimly. He had suspected the network was larger than what he'd uncovered, but hearing confirmation made the challenge seem even more daunting. Still, he had committed to this fight and he wouldn't back down now. "Then we'll expose all of them," Marcus replied with quiet determination. "Every last one." Detective Holbrook's cooperation opened floodgates that even Marcus hadn't expected. The files Holbrook provided contained 20 years of meticulous record-keeping, photographs of money exchanges, recordings of conversations, detailed logs of case outcomes that had been purchased rather than judged. What emerged was a criminal enterprise that made individual corruption look insignificant by comparison. The network reached far beyond Judge Harrison and Vincent Corelli. 3 other judges were taking bribes, 4 prosecutors were on the payroll, and 2 state legislators had been manipulating laws to benefit the organization. Most shocking of all was the involvement of District Attorney Linda Morrison, the top law enforcement official in the county, who had been coordinating the entire operation. "Morrison runs the whole thing," Holbrook explained during a secure debriefing session with Marcus and FBI agent Sarah Chen, whom Marcus had brought in from federal contacts. "She decides which cases get prosecuted, which evidence gets suppressed, which defendants get railroaded. Corelli pays her. She distributes the money and assignments down the chain." Agent Chen studied the files with growing amazement. "This is the largest judicial corruption case I've ever seen. We're talking about hundreds of wrongful convictions, millions in stolen money, and a complete breakdown of the justice system in this county." Marcus felt both vindicated and overwhelmed. His investigation had uncovered something far bigger than he'd imagined, but the scope also made it more dangerous. The corrupt network had tentacles throughout local government and wouldn't hesitate to eliminate threats. The danger became real when Holbrook's handler at the FBI safe house reported suspicious activity. Cars had been following the safe house. Phone calls were being made to numbers associated with organized crime, and someone had attempted to access federal databases containing information about protected witnesses. "They know Holbrook is cooperating," Agent Chen told Marcus during an emergency meeting. "Morrison has contacts in federal law enforcement. We have to assume they know everything we're doing." This revelation forced Marcus to accelerate his timeline. Instead of slowly building a case, he needed to move quickly before the corrupt network could eliminate witnesses or destroy evidence. But rushing also increased the risk of mistakes that could let criminals escape justice. Marcus's military training proved invaluable in this crisis. He treated the situation like a combat operation, identifying primary objectives, backup plans, and contingency procedures. His first priority was protecting the witnesses who had risked everything to expose the truth. Tony Ricci, Detective Santos, and Detective Holbrook all needed federal protection. His second priority was gathering enough evidence to ensure convictions, even if some witnesses were compromised. Marcus worked with Agent Chen to execute simultaneous raids on offices, homes, and safe deposit boxes belonging to network members. They had to strike all targets at once to prevent evidence destruction. The raids were scheduled for dawn on a Tuesday, but District Attorney Morrison received advance warning from her federal contact. She immediately called an emergency meeting of the corrupt network, not knowing that FBI surveillance was recording every word. "The Thompson investigation has gotten out of control," Morrison told the assembled judges, prosecutors, and Corelli's representatives. "Holbrook has flipped. The FBI is involved, and we're looking at federal charges for everyone. We need to eliminate the threat permanently." Judge Harrison, who had been growing increasingly paranoid since the Mitchell trial, pushed for extreme measures. "Thompson needs to have an accident. Make it look like a car crash, a robbery gone wrong, anything that removes him from the equation." Vincent Corelli, participating by secure phone, was more calculating. "Killing a former royal guard will bring too much attention. But there are other ways to neutralize him. Disbar him for misconduct, frame him for corruption, destroy his credibility." The recorded conversation provided federal prosecutors with conspiracy charges that could put the entire network away for decades. But Marcus knew they would try to implement their plans before being arrested, making the next few days extremely dangerous. Agent Chen placed Marcus under protective surveillance, but he insisted on continuing his legal work. Several families whose relatives had been wrongfully convicted were depending on him to appeal their cases, and Marcus wouldn't abandon them even for his own safety. The attempts on Marcus's life came in subtle forms designed to look accidental. A gas leak in his office building that could have caused an explosion. Brake fluid drained from his car before a long highway drive. Food poisoning from a restaurant where Corelli had connections. Each attempt was foiled by Marcus's military-trained paranoia and the FBI's protective measures. Meanwhile, the federal investigation was yielding incredible results. Bank records showed millions of dollars flowing through shell companies controlled by Morrison and Corelli. Recorded conversations revealed specific instances of case fixing, witness intimidation, and evidence suppression. Phone records connected corrupt officials to organized crime figures throughout the region. The breakthrough came when Agent Chen discovered that Morrison had been using her position to protect a human trafficking operation run by Corelli's organization. Young women were being brought into the country illegally and forced into prostitution, while Morrison ensured that any investigations were buried or redirected. "This changes everything," Agent Chen told Marcus. "Human trafficking is a federal priority. We can get resources from multiple agencies, and the penalties are severe enough that some defendants will flip to avoid life sentences." Marcus felt a mixture of satisfaction and disgust. His investigation had started with a simple robbery case involving an innocent teenager, but it had exposed crimes far more serious than judicial corruption. The scope of human suffering caused by this network was staggering. As federal agencies prepared to make arrests, Marcus received an unexpected call. Judge Harrison, realizing that his world was crumbling, wanted to meet privately. The judge claimed he had information that could help reduce his sentence, but Marcus suspected a trap. "It's too dangerous," Agent Chen warned. "Harrison is desperate, and desperate people do unpredictable things." But Marcus had spent his career protecting others from dangerous people, and he wasn't about to let fear stop him from gathering evidence that could help convict the entire network. Against FBI advice, he agreed to meet Harrison in a public location with full surveillance backup. The meeting would prove to be the final confrontation between Marcus and the corrupt judge who had started this entire investigation. What Harrison didn't know was that Marcus had prepared for this moment from the very beginning, and the former royal guard was about to deliver justice in a way the judge never saw coming. Judge Harrison chose the city's oldest courthouse for their meeting, perhaps hoping the familiar surroundings would give him psychological advantage. Marcus arrived early, checking the building with the thoroughness that had kept dignitaries alive during his guard service. FBI surveillance teams positioned themselves discreetly throughout the area, ready to intervene if necessary. Harrison looked haggard when he arrived, his usual confident demeanor replaced by the desperate appearance of a cornered animal. 20 years of corruption had finally caught up with him, and the weight of impending justice showed in every line of his face. "Thompson," Harrison began without preamble, "you have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. This organization has protected this county for decades, kept order, prevented chaos." Marcus remained calm, his military bearing unchanged. By selling justice to the highest bidder? By framing innocent people like Danny Mitchell? Mitchell? Harrison laughed bitterly. "That case was nothing. You destroyed everything over one teenage punk who got lucky." The judge's callous dismissal of Danny's suffering revealed everything Marcus needed to know about Harrison's character. This wasn't a man who had gradually been corrupted. This was someone who had never understood the true meaning of justice. "I have a proposition," Harrison continued, leaning forward conspiratorially. "Join us. Your military background, your legal skills, your apparent immunity to intimidation, you could be valuable. Very valuable. We're talking about more money than you could make in 10 lifetimes of honest practice." Marcus had expected this approach. Corrupt people always assumed others shared their moral flexibility, unable to comprehend genuine integrity. "Judge Harrison, you're offering me a bribe to overlook your crimes. That's another felony to add to your list." Harrison's face reddened with frustration. "You self-righteous fool. Do you think the system was working before we took control? Crime was rampant. Businesses were failing. Families were fleeing the county. We brought order. You brought corruption, Marcus replied evenly. You perverted justice for personal gain and caused immeasurable harm to innocent people. The judge's desperation shifted to anger, as he realized Marcus couldn't be bought or intimidated. Fine, you want to play the noble hero? Let me tell you what's going to happen. Morrison has connections you can't imagine. Federal judges, Justice Department officials, senators who owe their careers to our organization. Your little investigation will disappear. Your evidence will be ruled inadmissible, and you'll be disbarred for fabricating charges against respected public officials. Marcus smiled grimly. Judge Harrison, you're making another mistake. You assume I'm working alone, that this is just about local corruption? Harrison's confidence faltered as he saw something in Marcus's expression that worried him. What do you mean? I mean that while you've been focusing on local damage control, federal agencies have been building cases against your entire network. The human trafficking operation, the money laundering, the racketeering charges, they're all documented with evidence that can't be suppressed or dismissed. The color drained from Harrison's face. Human trafficking? I wasn't involved in anything like that. Marcus studied the judge's reaction carefully. Harrison's shock seemed genuine, suggesting that not all network members knew the full scope of Corelli's operations. This information could be useful for prosecution strategy. Judge Harrison, Vincent Corelli has been using your court system to protect a trafficking ring that's destroyed dozens of young women's lives. Every time you dismissed charges against his associates, every time you suppressed evidence in cases involving his businesses, you were enabling those crimes. Harrison slumped in his chair, the full weight of his complicity finally hitting him. I thought it was just about construction contracts, some gambling operations, maybe loan sharking. I never knew about women being hurt. But you knew innocent people were being framed, Marcus pressed. You knew evidence was being planted. Witnesses were being intimidated. You chose money over justice every single time. The judge sat in silence for several minutes, his hands shaking as he contemplated the ruins of his career and reputation. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. What do you want from me? Marcus leaned forward, his expression serious but not unsympathetic. I want you to do the right thing for once. Cooperate fully with federal investigators. Provide testimony about the network's operations. Help us identify all the victims of this conspiracy. And in return, you might receive some consideration at sentencing. More importantly, you might be able to live with yourself knowing you finally chose justice over personal gain. Harrison's internal struggle was visible as he weighed his options. Cooperation meant admitting to years of corruption and facing certain prison time. But refusing to cooperate meant facing even harsher federal charges with no possibility of redemption. There are things you don't understand, Harrison said finally. Morrison has files on everyone. Judges, prosecutors, politicians, business leaders. She's been collecting blackmail material for decades. If this network falls, a lot of powerful people will go down with it. Marcus felt a chill of understanding. The corruption was even more extensive than they had discovered. Morrison wasn't just running a local criminal enterprise. She was operating a political blackmail ring that could reach the highest levels of government. Those files, Marcus said urgently. Where does she keep them? Multiple locations. Safe deposit boxes, private vaults, digital storage with automatic release protocols. If anything happens to Morrison, everything gets released to the media and law enforcement simultaneously. This revelation complicated the federal investigation significantly. Simply arresting Morrison could trigger a massive political scandal that might damage innocent people, while allowing the truly guilty to escape in the chaos. Judge Harrison, I need you to help us locate those files before the arrests begin. If Morrison realizes how much we know, she might activate those release protocols out of spite. Harrison nodded slowly, his decision finally made. I'll help you. God help me. I'll help you clean up this mess I've been part of. As Harrison provided details about Morrison's blackmail operations, Marcus realized that his investigation had evolved far beyond local corruption. They were now dealing with a conspiracy that could shake the foundations of government at multiple levels. The meeting ended with Harrison agreeing to wear a wire for his next conversation with Morrison, hoping to gather evidence about the blackmail files' locations. As the judge left, looking older and more defeated than when he arrived, Marcus felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. Justice was finally within reach. But the scope of the conspiracy meant that some very powerful people would fight desperately to prevent exposure. The next phase would test everything Marcus had learned about courage, strategy, and the true meaning of justice. Agent Chen joined Marcus as Harrison disappeared into the courthouse shadows. "Did you get what we needed?" "More than we expected," Marcus replied grimly. "But also more than we might be able to handle. This is about to become very complicated." As they walked away from the courthouse where his journey had begun, Marcus reflected on how far he had come from his days as a royal guard. He had traded protecting individuals for protecting the entire concept of justice itself. The battle was far from over, but for the first time since witnessing that first corrupt conversation, Marcus felt confident that truth would ultimately prevail. The final operation unfolded like a military campaign, with Marcus coordinating between multiple federal agencies to simultaneously secure Morrison's blackmail files and arrest the entire corruption network. Judge Harrison's cooperation proved invaluable as he led investigators to 3 separate locations where Morrison stored her insurance materials. The morning of the arrests, Marcus stood in the FBI command center watching as teams moved across the county. 27 warrants were executed simultaneously. Judges, prosecutors, police officers, politicians, and business leaders all taken into custody before they could destroy evidence or flee. Vincent Corelli was arrested at his mansion while trying to board a private jet to a non-extradition country. District Attorney Morrison's arrest provided the most dramatic moment. When federal agents arrived at her office, she was frantically trying to activate her blackmail file release protocols. Agent Chen's team had anticipated this, having already secured the files and disabled her deadman switches. Morrison's last desperate attempt to cause maximum damage failed completely. "It's over, Linda," Agent Chen announced as Morrison was handcuffed. "We have everything. The bank records, the recordings, the trafficking evidence, and your blackmail files. There's nowhere left to run." Morrison's composure finally cracked as she realized the full scope of the investigation. "Thompson," she spat as she was led away. "This is all because of that military Boy Scout who couldn't mind his own business." Marcus watched the arrest from the courthouse steps, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. Justice was being served, but the human cost of decades of corruption couldn't be undone. Hundreds of innocent people had been wrongfully convicted, families had been destroyed, and victims of trafficking would carry their trauma forever. The trials that followed became a media sensation, with Marcus serving as the lead prosecution witness in case after case. His military background and unshakable integrity made him a compelling figure, and his testimony helped secure convictions against every major network member. Judge Harrison received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation, serving 6 years in federal prison before being released to a quiet retirement. His testimony proved crucial in convicting Morrison, who received life imprisonment for racketeering, corruption, and human trafficking charges. Detective Holbrook entered witness protection with his family, starting a new life in a distant state where his past couldn't endanger them. Before leaving, he thanked Marcus for offering him a path to redemption, rather than simply seeking revenge. Vincent Corelli's empire collapsed completely. His construction company was seized under asset forfeiture laws. His money was confiscated to compensate victims, and he received multiple life sentences for trafficking, racketeering, and conspiracy charges. The man who had once controlled an entire county's justice system died in federal prison 5 years later. The aftermath of the investigation brought sweeping reforms to the county's legal system. New judges were appointed from outside the region, prosecutors were brought in from federal agencies, and oversight mechanisms were established to prevent future corruption. Marcus was offered the position of district attorney but declined, preferring to continue his private practice helping victims of the corrupt system. Danny Mitchell, the teenager whose case had started everything, graduated from college and entered law school, inspired by Marcus's example. Sarah Mitchell often said that Marcus hadn't just saved her son from wrongful conviction. He had saved their entire community from a system that had forgotten its purpose. 5 years after the arrests, Marcus stood in the same courthouse where he had first challenged Judge Harrison's authority. The building looked the same, but everything about it had changed. New judges focused on justice rather than personal gain, Prosecutors sought truth rather than convenient convictions, and police officers investigated crimes rather than manufacturing them. Professor Williams, Marcus's former law school mentor, visited him during the anniversary week of the first arrests. She found him in his office, still working late to help families torn apart by the corrupt system. "Marcus," she said, looking around at the case files covering his desk, "you've accomplished something remarkable. You've proven that one person with courage and integrity can change an entire system." Marcus looked up from a case involving a wrongfully convicted father seeking custody of his children. "It wasn't just one person, Professor. It took Tony Ricci's courage to testify, Detective Santos's willingness to expose corruption, Holbrook's decision to cooperate, and dozens of federal agents risking their careers to pursue justice. But it started with you," she insisted. "When you witnessed that first conversation between Harrison and Corelli, you could have ignored it, reported it through channels that might have buried it, or simply transferred to a different district. Instead, you chose to fight." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "My oath as a Royal Guard was to protect the innocent. When I became a lawyer, that oath didn't change. It just expanded to include protecting justice itself." As Professor Williams left, Marcus returned to his work, knowing that the fight for justice never truly ends. There would always be those who sought to corrupt systems for personal gain, and there would always be a need for people willing to stand against them. The young man who had once stood guard outside diplomatic receptions had become something more, a guardian of justice who had proven that corruption, no matter how deeply entrenched, could be defeated by unwavering integrity and careful preparation. The corrupt network that had controlled the county for decades was destroyed, its members imprisoned or disgraced, its victims compensated and vindicated. Marcus Thompson had kept his oath in the most profound way possible, protecting not just individuals but the very concept of justice under law. Years later, when law students studied the case that became known as the Royal Guard prosecution, they would learn that sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption isn't political influence or vast resources. It's one person who refuses to compromise their principles no matter what the cost.